Hello guys, it's Sahtiar. This video is an overview of all 3.5 Warrior DPS specs. I've decided to make 2 minutes 30 parses on dummy to compare DPS of those specs and to discuss how useful a spec is. Detailed guide for each spec can be found on the official Rift forum. Let's get started with Paragon. Here you can see the spec I was using, and you will also see my current gear. This is my current gear with all the corresponding stats. So Paragon is at the moment highest single target DPS spec for Warrior and one of the highest single target DPS specs among all classes. It's very useful spec in a raid and it can be used in PvP as well. It's purely physical damage and it has insanely high burst. I would recommend using it on most of the bosses in the latest raid. One of the problems with the spec though is that it has absolutely no AoE. It only has an ability which spreads damage, but it's really bad. I don't recommend using it. If you would have to pad, I would just use Riftblade instead. This spec is really good for fast and efficient target swapping. It's the best target swapping spec a warrior has. It has only one damage over time effect and all the rest of the abilities are instant. This is a melee spec, but it has an ability called Grasping the Horizon, which increases range of all melee attacks by 20 meters. I recommend using that ability each time you have to swap to the different target, when the tank pulls a boss and when there are disconnects in certain boss fights. The ability is really good because it can have up to a 50% uptime. It's a 30-second cooldown ability and the buff is up for 15 seconds. When I was parsing these specs, I was using no vials, no weapon stones, no fist, no banners, sigils, no PA buffs, and there was no external help from any other player. As you can see in the video, Paragon does really high burst damage and its sustained damage is pretty high as well. As I said, it's really useful spec to use it for both PvE, PvP and open world content. The reason why Paragon is the highest warrior single target DPS spec is that its burst aligns perfectly with raid cooldowns, and that is one of the most important aspects when you're trying to deal high DPS in a raid. Next spec is Riftblade. This spec got buffed recently and is now one of the most useful warrior DPS specs. Its difference from Paragon is that it has really high AoE damage as well, so if there is a fight where you would like to pad as well, beside doing single target damage, I recommend using this spec. The problem with the spec is that it's a bit bugged and sometimes ability might not work as you would like them to. The spec isn't fixed yet and I don't know if they intend on fixing it at all. And due to those bugs and not working abilities, it deals way less DPS in a raid than somebody would want it to. I like using it on some certain fights like Lady Justice and Enrag the Fall in Gilded Prophecy raid, but beside that, if there is a pure single target boss fight, I would prefer using Paragon instead. This spec can be used in PvP as well, but the problem is that it has many damage over time effects which are not that useful in PvP, because in some certain cases they will get cleansed and it's like not worth using them at all. Next we have Tempest. Tempest is the highest ranged single target DPS spec for a warrior. It's really good because, as I mentioned earlier with Paragon, Its cooldown align perfectly with raid cooldowns, and same goes for Tempest, and that's why it's really good to use it in a raid. If a raid struggles with managing cooldowns properly, this spec will do way less damage than it possibly can. So if the raid cooldowns are good, this spec will do really good damage as well. And besides single target damage, it has a bit of AoE damage as well, which can be used for padding on the ads if needed. I don't like using this spec for PvP. The reason for that is that cooldowns in PvP, let's say Warfronts, are completely random and it isn't good for this spec. The second thing is that it has two really good channeled abilities, but in PvP they get interrupted easily, so you are left with an interrupted cast and a loss of a global cooldown. So let's take a look at the infamous Reaver now. This spec used to be really good and useful in a raid, but with recent changes, few patches ago, it got changed dramatically. Its passive AoE cleave got removed. A viral stream, you have to stand still now when you are casting it, and the overall damage got reduced by like 10%, so it's not a useful spec for a raid anymore. But even with not being a raid spec, I still like to use it in a PvP. The reason for that is that its damage over time effects apply a special debuff to enemy, reducing their damage, their healing done, and you can change the outcome of a teamfight using this spec. But if you use it in a raid, you will most probably get called a baddie or a noob. Let's take a look at the Warlord now. This spec isn't used in PvE at all. I personally haven't used it in a single raid in Nightmare Tide expansion, so I don't recommend using it as well. The problem with the spec is that its damage just simply isn't high enough, but beside that it can be still useful. It has an ability which is similar to the Filer Link, which reduces damage on a person by 15%. It can be put on a tank and it would help survive the tank. But there are just better options in raid, so it's not used at all. Meanwhile, it can be pretty funny to play in PvP. The reason for that is that it has a lot of survivability in its kit, like healing cooldowns when you would die and reduce damage taken by like 30%, which can make it a pretty versatile spec. One of the things I dislike with it is that it has no ranged ability, so you are forced to be melee the whole time when you are using it, and this is really bad if you are trying to deal decent DPS in either raid or PvP. Now we are gonna take a look at the champion. This spec cannot compete with the single target DPS of the specs shown before, and the reason for that is that it's purely an AoE spec. It has the highest AoE damage of all specs in Rift. I personally managed to do like 450k solo against 10 dummies, so it's really good for AoE. And because of its great AoE damage, this spec is used when there are a lot of ads. One of the best examples for that would be Metron Zamiraf, third boss in Hammernell Fortress, or second if you wanna go there first. And it was used on Xylas as well, because you have to deal with many ads there. But besides those two bosses, it wasn't really used that much, because some other specs just deal better ratio between single target damage and AoE damage, one of them being Riftblade. Next spec is 48 Beastmaster. This isn't a pure DPS spec because it's a support spec, which means this spec isn't used to just deal big damage, but is used because it has raid cooldowns, which can help the raid do more damage and make them survive longer. The reason why it's used is the ability in Rage, which increases damage, crit power by 10%, and it's a unique buff for crit power in this game. It also increases damage done by 5% and crit chance by 5%, if I remember correctly. So basically it's really good spec, and that's why this spec is used mostly in a raid. It stacks with an Archon, and it has unique defensive cooldowns which might reduce damage taken to whole raid by like 30% or something, which can help if there are big kills to be done. And the second spec is also Beastmaster, but this one is 54 Beastmaster. It has 6 more points in Beastmaster, and it has 2 more supportive abilities. And this spec is like, if you're not gonna use an Archon, this spec was used on Crucia because everybody has to be spread the whole time, and Archon would be pretty much useless there because only few people would benefit from Lava Field, while the whole raid benefits from Enrage because it has 25 meter range, I think. And that's why this spec is really useful and must to have as well. And if you wanna be a useful warrior in a raid, it's really necessary you learn those 2 specs, cause it might help the raid to kill some certain bosses you wouldn't be able to kill otherwise. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have any questions regarding those specs, feel free to write a comment or contact me in-game. And on this picture you can see the DPS of the specs shown before. The DPS is as it was at 2 minutes 30. The only difference is for Reaver, which energy starves, and Warlord as well. I took those at 1:30 for Warlord and 1 minute for Reaver.